everybody to this Talking Tuesday hosted by the Financial Services Panel. A short introduction to the Financial Services Panel. We were set up about a year ago and we're still going through our strategy, but our terms of reference are that we're to focus on the financial services technology. Our purpose is to support people working in the sector, and our scope is it encompasses FinTech, but all other digital technologies in banking, insurance, legal, accountancy, and investment management. So it's quite wide. Now, in terms of what we want to do as we go forward, we want to be known for helping young people into careers in financial services technology. And we'd like to start building awareness in schools. Of course, we're building much closer ties with our journeyman scheme. And in fact, one of our speakers, the first one to speak to us, is Anders, who is a freshly minted freeman. He had just finished being a journeyman. So, you know, here we are already having a member from the journeyman scheme. We want to be known for championing diversity. We are diverse. And so we feel that we can add real value there. And we also want to be known as the place to go to debate the issues of the day. And we want to really try and take a lead in putting our livery at the centre of that in the City of London. And by the city, we do mean City, Canary Wharf, and in fact, anywhere in the UK that financial services are practiced, are operating, which is just about anywhere. Now, given that as a background, it brings me to the topic of the day, which is ESG, environmental, social, and governance. There's been a bit of a buzz about this particular topic. And I heard it being talked about everywhere at WCIT and everywhere we go. And amongst our Financial Services Panel members, we thought it would be a good one to kick off with. As we looked at it, we realized how very broad it is as a topic. And there's no way we're going to cover it in just one session. So we're hoping today that we will ignite a debate, that we're going to make a start. And we'd like to hear from you as we go through on what else you'd like to hear or what actions you feel we can take. Now, in general, in life and society, we've already seen the so-called blue planet effect, where we've got leading corporates like Amazon, JP Morgan, already signaling that they're moving from what used to be shareholder primacy to more stakeholder commitment. And one of the stakeholders is actually the environment. We're also hearing from regulators that they're going to have much greater scrutiny, and they're going to insist on more disclosure on environmental and social factors. So that's our backdrop. But ESG is only one component of what everybody's referring to now as responsible investment. And if that's the case, then what does that really mean? Does being good and having a high ESG rating mean that an organization increases its likelihood of performing better financially? And what is it that we should do within WCIT? Do we need to make changes to how we operate in terms of us as a company, but also as a charity? And should we go further? Should we, you know, if we want to lead the city, should we be actually looking to encourage organizations to become far more ESG compliant? So please tell us what you think. Please ask questions in the chat box. And to help us through, we've got a very, very capable chair. We have a wonderful panel. We've got experts really from across WCIT, and it's wonderful to see that we do have this level of experience and expertise that we could call on. And we're trialing, by the way, this event at WCIT because we do want to run an external event quite soon as another big kickoff into our idea that we want to lead the city in this debate. Now, our chair is going to be John Gavin. You might know him as being an executive, senior executive, very, very well respected in the banking sector. But most of all, he's our rowing master, really. And you will know him as the CETO panel chair. Now, before I hand over to John, I'm sure that we've all experienced this crisis, and, you know, we're just getting bored with it. But it really has had a huge and adverse impact on the WCIT charity income. So before we start, I'd like to hand over to Steve, and I'd like him please to play a small video for us on our charity. And if you enjoy the event tonight, normally we would meet, normally we would pay something of a fee, a small fee, which would then go into the charity. Please feel free to donate. So I'll hand over to you, Steve, and then on to John.
The charities we work with quite literally change lives. Our strategic partner, Lifelights, provides technology to children's hospices across the UK, bringing communication and inclusion where it's most needed. Our grant to Thames Reach enables them to provide technology training to the homeless and vulnerably housed, so they have the digital skills necessary in today's society and job market. Our AI for C initiative is bringing charities together to create AI that helps those in the most dangerous and isolated positions, who often need immediate intervention to remain safe. None of this could be done without you, our donors. Your contributions, whether large or small, make the difference between being able to make grants or not. By pulling together now, while times are so tough for so many, we can help make their future considerably brighter, both during and after the pandemic. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your generosity.
Thank you very much, Kerry, and thank you very much for your heartfelt introduction there, Julia. It was, I know this is a topic very close to your heart. So for your sins this evening, I'm chairing this meeting. We've got some absolutely tremendous speakers, world-class speakers for you this evening. I'm always absolutely impressed by the depth of knowledge that we have within our company. It's a very fertile base, and we've got some of those very, shall we say, strong bells which have come forth from the company on this very topic tonight. So what we'd like to do is to each will spend about 8 minutes. In fact, it will be 8 minutes, just to run through some of their thoughts. They're all going to come from slightly different positions. That part of the mix of the panel was our intention to do this because, as Julia said, this is a very vast topic, and we're just really at this stage skimming over the surface of it. So we'll take 8 minutes each, and then we'll open to questions. If you could put your questions through on the chat line, then we can consolidate those or ask those at the end of the session. So I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to introduce our speakers. We have Anders, and I think you can see Anders up in the top corner. Anders is a strategy consultant. He has a vast amount of experience in terms of across the retail sector, and he has a good deal of experience clearly with implementing the digital platforms which enable businesses to really engage across the web. So he's got a perspective really coming from the point of view of seeing within those companies how they've interpreted their ESG commitments. We're then going to follow that by Indira, who's got bringing a very a strong mix of corporate understanding to this, because Indira has been on the other side of the fence, and he has had to look at this from the corporate perspective. He's got a large amount of experience crossing the property, global insurance areas, and added to that, he's a technology evangelist as well. So undoubtedly he'll be telling us how some of the impacts of technology could assist us with our ESG mission. We're then going to have past master Ray Long, and Ray is going to come from a government perspective. He's after his 40 years of service in government, at senior levels across various functions of government, he can give us a perspective there of how people, for example, in the Cabinet Office and other functions in government see this drive in terms of ESG and implementing ESG. We then have someone who's hands-on, who really is at the sharp end of it, and in terms of Gary, and I've known Gary many years, and he's had his corporate experience, but now is the Chief Executive Officer of AbilityNet. And AbilityNet is an astounding charity which actually helps companies and people deal with very difficult situations in terms of access and in terms of actually being able to operate with disabilities in the workplace. And clearly he's very dependent on the, or AbilityNet's actually very dependent on corporate and social responsibility policies of the various supporters that he has. And then we're going to finish with Rob, and Rob has will give us another interesting perspective from. Rob has had a considerable amount of experience as an investor, and he's also chairman of a group called PlayMob, which you should have a look at. And this is really to help people, it's really getting people to engage with these weighty topics such as climate change, digital inclusion, and even personal hygiene. I haven't quite worked out exactly how he does that, but you know, that's definitely included. So we're going to work through, and each will give their perspectives, and then you can bring your questions as and when you go through, and you'll have a chance to put them to the team afterwards. So if we could perhaps start, Anders, if I could ask you to take the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Firstly, to open up the discussion about ESG, I think I'll spend a bit of time in my presentation just laying the foundation for what ESG is. And for that to be credible, I'd like to just present what my own sort of experience with it has been recently. Over the last year, I've spent almost 11 months on a client assignment working on implementing ESG for BFSI. And in that, a lot of the work was spent on defining various ways of convincing stakeholders and clients of the value of ESG data. So I feel like I have a pretty good foundational knowledge base to build on this. In the presentation now, I'll be spending a bit of time talking about where ESG comes from, and also what the purpose of it is, because it can become very sort of virtuous and very value driven, but it has a core purpose. And then I'll round off by talking about the future of ESG for businesses and for investments. Great. So the origin of ESG is quite recent. Everything actually comes from John Elkington, a British author and CSR authority. He's one of the key people behind it. And what he talked about was actually value creation in businesses and how value should be produced in many more ways than just financial value. And this is no new thing, but the way that businesses are structured and measured are through financial value almost entirely. At least it used to be. I think the times are changing, and I think we'll come to that. So what John Elkington really wrote about was the cost beyond costs, the idea of there being negative externalities or negative effects of businesses acting in various ways, because all they measured was profits, and because that was a yearly cycle, nothing outside that was really driven by anything of noteworthy societal or environmental value. And that sort of led to the idea of codifying morality in business. That's essentially a reaction to how 20th century business logic was approached by economists like Milton Friedman, who argue that business's only purpose is to create shareholder value. But what kind of value, that was never really discussed. Now, in the 21st century as well, we're faced with also an all-time high level of globalization, and that leads to human consideration, because the negative externalities and effects that we are facing are borderless. Carbon doesn't care about borders, pollution doesn't care about borders, climate change doesn't care about borders, and many other things that impact human beings, they don't care about borders. So it's worth keeping in mind that there are a couple of seminal pieces of literature on this subject. Cannibals with Forks is I guess the first one that came out in 1998, and then the late Kofi Annan, he chaired a committee at the UN where they wrote "Who Cares Wins," which is a very, very important piece driving the financial investment part of this. So this is just a simple timeline, putting a few of the important points for ESG sort of on a line to see where they started. It's important to note that the value driven in businesses is nothing new. Many businesses are purely driven by the idea of financial value because that's how the stock market values them. But the idea of being virtuous is not a new thing, and it shouldn't be regarded as something new. But anyway, in 1998, John Elkington writes Cannibals with Forks, where he essentially talks about this idea of there being more than a single kind of value you can measure on. Now, that idea was picked up by the financial markets, and John Elkington built a business based on selling an early version of ESG data to investment companies. That was recognized by the UN in 2004. They came out with a report called Who Cares Wins, where they put out a preliminary framework on how to attack responsible investing. Only a few years later, we see how important ESG is because the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis essentially tears down the financial world, and it really highlights how badly governed our financial institutions are and how little they care about morality and about values beyond profits. So this really also catapulted the discussion in our work in the company I work for. We've seen how the talks about ESG actually starts almost entirely at 2008. That's where people started caring because they saw this kind of actions. Now, a person that we're hoping to bring into a future event with the WCIT is Alex Edmonds. He is a former finance professor at Wharton, and he also has produced a lot of research into this topic. He's also written a book called Grow the Pie, which is essentially about ESG investing. But back in 2011, he showed how the 100 highest ESG rated companies outperformed the market consistently by 2.4% per year, which is very big. He is now the finance professor at Gresham College, and he's also a finance professor at London Business School. So only last year, Christine Lagarde, the former director of the International Monetary Fund, she spoke at Guildhall at a World Traders event, and I was actually there. And it was a really good event because she talked about how finance is actually a really good institution if it's governed correctly. And I think this is, again, a key thing to keep in mind. I'll come back to this in a second, but she also really highlighted the value of ESG. A very, very important event happened in January of this year, and that was Larry Fink, BlackRock's founder and CEO, who came out and said, from now on, no investment in BlackRock will be evaluated only on profit. Actually, ESG data based on two frameworks that they've selected will be central pieces in BlackRock committing money to their investments because they have to care about the effects that their investments have on the world when they own such large pieces of the largest companies in the world. So this is almost where we are at this point, and this is just a quick summary of that. So I've just taken a quote from the talk that Christine Lagarde gave at Guildhall last year, and she says essentially there's a huge change coming because so much money is being inherited by young people who have a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. They are much more likely to invest in social and environmental outcomes, and for this reason, and partially also because of the opportunism that exists in finance, there will be new solutions coming into play that they can invest in. And we already see this from green bonds to ESG funds and so on. There's lots of options coming out. And she really spoke about the financial sector owning up to that and saying, actually, if that's what you want, then we're happy to provide it. And they tried to provide these things because there is a retail value in it, but also now that there's more governance around it, it's really, really vital for them. A point to make on ESG data when it comes to financial profits is that it's been proven a few times through research that the only factor that really leads to higher profit is governance. I think some of the other speakers on this event might talk about that, but environmental savviness and social savviness actually don't lead to financial profits, which is unfortunately maybe a bit sad, but that's almost arbitraged out of the way at this point. But governance still provides excess returns. So if you find a company with good governance scores, maybe it's time to invest. Right. So I have 2 slides left, and one of the things I want to focus on now is just the purpose of ESG. I mentioned briefly in the beginning that ESG is about recognizing long-run negative externalities of businesses, and this is nothing new in terms of economics. You look at the negative effects of businesses on their environments and how that limits future profits. But businesses run on a year-to-year cycle because that's when their annual account statements have to be handed in. But effects like climate change happen over a scale of 20 to 40 years. So how do you put that into play? And what you can do is invoke new shared understandings of what ethical behavior is. And that's really what the SASB framework, what the UN Sustainable Development Goals are, and what the MSCI ACWI ESG framework is all about. There's many of these frameworks, they all show the same thing. They all target ESG, and they all aim to create actionable insights that can provide incentive for change through increased investment attractiveness. And that's also because businesses can now be held accountable to some of these factors. If you know the score of a company relative to another score, then you can hold them accountable. So the future of ESG is still unknown. We don't know where it's going to take us exactly. We don't know exactly the retail impact it's going to have. But what we can say for sure is that ESG is going to be more widespread. The adoption is going to go up. And I think I've seen that over the last year. We saw almost no competitors in the space that we went into when I started my client assignment last year. But at the end of it, there was multiple competitors with quite astute and good understanding of ESG and how to put it into retail. And this is also something we're going to see downstream because it's very retail driven. We see the certified B companies, which is a collective of companies following a set of ethical and morale standards. So you'll see companies like The Body Shop and Patagonia and many others joining this, and they have to live up to certain standards to be part of this group. You'll also see carbon trackers like My Carbon Action, which is actually sort of a subsidiary of Infuse, which is a payment company. So they want to ensure that your finance is done in an ethical manner and that your carbon can be tracked across that. That's really, really cool. But this all comes down to essentially transparency and labeling for consumers. And once we know everything in the supply chain, which is what all the frameworks that we just discussed before, what they do, then we can start to create a holistic guide, and we can start to show consumers what it is the impact of their consumption is like. And that creates incentive for investment upstream because more attractive companies are the ones who can sell more. And if one of the key criteria for people to buy stuff is for environmental attractiveness and ESG attractiveness, then it's gonna be driven by that. And this, I think the last point I want to make is just that there's going to be an increased impact in the financial space. There already is. I don't think I've seen a single ETF provider or fund provider that don't have a green alternative, and green bonds are really being popularized right now across the world. But we also have to keep in mind that these models will interact with themselves. If we predict a lot of uptick in ESG performance investment-wise, then that's going to impact the models that are going to be used, and that might actually impact it as well. So it's a caution that we need to take, and we need to be cautious of the way we approach it, so we don't limit the effects that it can have, because it's actually really powerful, and it's gonna be a game changer. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that. I know that unfortunately you have to leave. You've got another commitment, but a very good opening summary there, and there's some good questions which have come from that. So could we move on to our next speaker now? And Steve, are you ready with the second set of slides? And we will have
yeah, I can see the slides. Thanks, John. Thank you, John.
Are you okay there? Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Indranil.
Yeah, good.
Clearly.
Thank you.
So perhaps
Thanks, John.
If you could move forward.
Sure. Thanks, John. So I'll take a few minutes to just throw light on my experience working on board and seeing how organizations are creating integrated value through sustainable innovation, but also talk about the myths and briefly touch about an example how insurance companies are looking into using ESG scorings and methods and methodologies to seek for sustainable development here. Now, obviously, Anders has done a fantastic, introduction to the topic. Now, what I see is the role of business in sustainable development is often related to corporate social responsibility and effort to decrease the environmental impact of the operation. And I think that's a myth because, however, CSR approach and the seek to optimize a firm's performance fail to contribute to sustainability transition in which environmental and social externalities are internalized. Now, we have seen disruptive and transformative business like Tesla or Uber or Airbnb are seen to shift the primary conditions under which market operates and create new realities. Yet, despite their disruptive character and the nature of such new facts and the relation to sustainability is not straightforward, when we see from a corporate perspective. So the big question is, what does it take for the business model to be transformative towards sustainability? So there is a lot of talk in the media these days, as Anders just mentioned. So top CEOs are questioning of the desired behavior, culture, and the purpose of what are companies for, as the board's responsibility and sustainability and resilience are placed at the center of the company's purpose. ESG is being viewed as the key investment risks, mainly profit, and when I say profit, prosperity, or people, planet, and the principles of governance. So to mention the drivers behind the purpose of ESG and enabling this resilience or the sustainabilities are a couple of them, or 5 different points that comes to my mind. So 1, allowing organizations to shift focus beyond the finite. 2, unify management and employees and stakeholders. 3, guideline cultures. 4, providing a framework for decision making. And 5, focus on helping develop a sustainable long-term financial results. Now, hence the expectation is that the board can explain what organization does. And when I say when organization does, I'm talking about the mission of the organization, and be able to express why the organization exists. So for the board, it has become more critical to reevaluate of the board, the purpose in the context of ESG, having clear understanding at board level of value creation that satisfies all stakeholders and not shareholders only. And I would say, and this is important, all stakeholders, and the business model, purpose, strategy, objectives, the principal risks of visibility, business environment, performance metrics that are realistic. So companies are revealing their reasons for existence, and social value is underway. So this leads to the question of how we create a sustainable system value creation. There are 3 conceptual challenges that are disconnecting the concept of corporate sustainability and sustainable development. First is the poor integration of the 3 dimensions, the economic, ecological, and social in the business sustainability discourse. And secondly, the insufficient integration of the societal macro level with the organizational micro level, and finally, the focus on economic success as the dominating performance level. And there are various frameworks, and the framework for sustainable value creation lies, again, on 3 conceptual prioritizing themes converging from sustainability, business models, and systems transition. And I'm not going to discuss that because that's a huge topic on its own, and it'd take hours to talk about it. But here in the slide, and what I'm trying to introduce is the alignment process that I've seen in the organizations and how they are reacting and creating integrated value through sustainable innovation. The mantra is, of course, apparent, it's clear, it's to achieve sustainable breakthrough through business models, and that will need to be social. And when I say social, delivering both financial and extra financial value through positive impacts of people in the present and the future, as Anders was mentioning. 2, lean, optimizing, and when I say lean, means optimizing the use of all form of capital, from physical and financial through human and intellectual to social and natural. 3, integrated, and I mean managing financial and extra financial value creation across the economic, social, and environmental system. And finally, needs to be circular, and that is sustaining input and output at their highest value in both technical and biological cycle. Okay? So that's what I'm seeing in the organizations, how they're looking at being social, lean, integrated, and circular to come and build or create an integrated value through sustainable innovation. Now, on the right, I have listed two common rating methodologies, and I think Anders, briefly touched about the ISG, that's ISS, ESG, and the Moody's that are used to assess the sustainability of risks, primarily in the financial service sector, but I'm clearly used by the insurers and the reinsurers that I see. Now, integrating the value is, of course, an essential evolution of the corporate responsibility and sustainability movement. But however, organizations that respond to the societal aspiration and the stakeholders' expectations in a credible way is very important. And integrated value have 5 main implications as sustainable business model. So it's about reassess, realign, redefine, redesign, and restructure. And the two tools that you see, and Anders also mentioned, already touched upon the UN Sustainable Development, Goal Action Manager, which is called as SDG, that helps identify or would help identify, where we would be in 2030 to create sustainable world we seek. He also has introduced to the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board materiality map that you see on my right side of the navigator. Again, this is a tool developed by SASB and identifies, compares and discloses topics across different sectors in insurance, and you have specifically for insurance and specifically for financial services sector. But I'm not going to go into the details because of lack of time, but these tools are very good tools that helps in building and creating that sustainable business. Yeah, so this slide is kind of an introduction to a case study, but and how specialty insurance and insurance companies are investing today to understand and adapt to the future of asset side and also on the underwriting side. And you see how they have a common theme on the global, from a global insurance perspective, and how they tie back into the SDGs, because most of the insurance companies are following the UN SDG. But it's interesting also to understand that the insurance industry is uniquely placed in our economies as a private market mechanism for sharing of risks. We know that, and with the global pooling of what would be the risk otherwise, borne solely by individuals and entities, which is estimated to trillions of pounds. And the convergence of the public and private interest in the insurance industry is nowhere, more apparent than in the risks and opportunities present in sustainability, captured by the ESG factors and issues. But there are basically 5 broad themes that I see and we have experienced in the insurance business. 1, the ESG factors influence the underwriting and have ranging degree of impact on line of business of insurance. It's very important from a finance perspective. 2, proper management of ESG factors potentially enhances an insurance company's earnings and long-term company value via avoided loss and new product offering. 3, given the assessment of the ESG risks, underwriting judge and the societal response for many of the ESG factors are underdeveloped, and if the regulatory framework is the precondition of being insurability, so that becomes very important. 4, the evolution of ESG factors in each region is different, and I've seen that very different in our business from A to B. But there are common aspects globally. And finally, active promotion and adoption of integrated ESG risks and management and risk management and financing is needed. So that's the way I see the 5 broad themes that's happening in the insurance business. Now, this slide is a pretty busy slide, but what I will touch upon is because it's an example that demonstrates how the reinsurance business are developing a framework, or reinsurance business are developing a framework both on the asset and the underwriting side. So you see in sustainability from the investment decisions, and then on the risk side and the impact of the assessments. But how insurers are evaluating the sustainability of the insurance portfolio. Now, in this case, it's a specialty insurance, because I've taken an example from SCOR reinsurance, along with the ESG and specialty insurance, and how they are getting aligned to the ESG scoring that I mentioned earlier, which is at the bottom. You see, what gets measured. That's the framework. So in specialty insurance, CSR, underwriting approach, ranges from many exclusions, I would say, because they look at tobacco exclusions, coal policies, dam policies, and of course they promote, virtuous lines, mainly in focus with climate change. Now, focus is yes. I will finish
just you're up against the time.
Yes, in a minute. The focus is qualifying in the near term of climate change and better reinsurance of societal decision making. Now, remember, the insurance business is sticky, and one cannot, securitize insurance risks. Well, some can, but not all. But majority of the insurance risks are not financial titles, and sticking to the reality and how it is measured is always a challenge. So here in this case, you see, how SCORE has created a precise analytical framework that needs to put in place, that they've put in place, and they're measuring, what is getting managed. So to conclude, Joan, I think although there are a lot of considerations being discussed, and I think one of the current, considerations in the current COVID crisis of the, because of the pandemic, influential, I'm hearing, that at least in the board level, influential investors have signaled that their continued focus on environmental matters and ESG disclosures have not changed. Actually, a recent study by Swiss Re suggests that the pandemic will continue to shift politics, regulations, and the market, and bring refocus on priorities and so on. But the containment measures, or lockdown may reduce your pollutions momentarily, but it's not going to stop global warming. So there's a huge focus to embrace on low carbon future, where sustainability is firmly embedded in our recovery policies or recovery strategies that I'm seeing in the business. So I'll end here because these are very broad topics, as Julie has mentioned in the very beginning. So over to you, John. Thank you.
Indranil, excellent. A lot of great content there, and I'm sure we can study those slides afterwards. But so if we could move on now to Ray, who could perhaps give us a government perspective or his experience within governmental circles regarding ESG.
Okay, thanks, John, and good evening, everybody. As John said in the introductions, my main career was in central government. I was a civil servant in a number of different government departments, including the Treasury's Office of Government Commerce and a part of the Cabinet Office, which is now called the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. So I'm going to say a few words about the role of government, and in particular our UK government, when it comes to environmental, social and governance issues. Now, I've been asked to focus on the degree to which the government should use its powers by stepping in to influence or even to dictate what happens in the marketplace if what's going on is seen to be undesirable or in need of improvement. So whilst there's plenty I could say about the government's own behaviour as an employer, and I'd be happy to take questions on that at the end, that's not the focus of this brief presentation. Here I'm going to draw your attention to some of the government's established policies regarding how it takes these issues into account when it spends taxpayers' money, and also how it sometimes regulates how others go about their business to take these things into account too, including a couple of recent initiatives. And I'll be interested to know during the discussion at the end whether you think these are appropriate areas for government to be involved with, and whether, if so, where you think it should go further. So let's start with something you might have heard of, and it's called the Treasury Green Book. Now, that's not green in the environmental sense, but in a sense that it's got a green cover, as opposed to the Treasury's Magenta Book and Aqua Book and Orange Book, which talk about other things. Its full title is Central Government Guidance on Appraisal and Evaluation, and it's in the public domain. You can download a copy from the website on the slide here. Now, this is the textbook that civil servants use to, first of all, identify new government policies in response to a ministerial direction to come up with a policy to deal with a particular issue, and then to work out the best way of implementing those policies. And it includes guidance on the 5 different types of business case which have to be made before a spending proposal is approved within government. Now, one of those is obviously the financial case. Is it affordable and good value for money, what's being proposed? One is commercial. Can it be delivered by those who supply goods and services to governments? Then there's the strategic case. Does it address the problem ministers are trying to solve? And does it align with the government's wider policies? And there's the management case. Is it actually doable? But the fifth one is especially interesting in the context of our discussion tonight. It's called the economic case. And the Green Book defines this as the net value to society, or the social value of the intervention that's being considered compared to continuing with business as usual. It asks which option for implementing a government policy reflects the optimal net value to society, including where appropriate the impact on different groups of people. And there's an annex in the Green Book which goes into a lot of detail about what the Treasury calls non-market valuation and unmonetizable values. It discusses environmental effects, sustainability, and social welfare implications, all of which have to be taken into account, even if they can't all have a financial value attached to them, in deriving the net present social value, not the NPV in accounting terms, but the net present social value of a proposal, so that not just the financial aspects, but the wider effects on society can be considered too before a decision is made on the best way forward. So that's how government organisations make these decisions when it comes to spending your money. And whilst you'd expect me to say this, of course, I commend to you the way that civil servants do these things. So have a look at the Treasury's Green Book if you want to see what I think is a fine model of this sort of approach. And check out too the 2012 Public Services Social Value Act, which Rob is going to refer to in his presentation. There's a handy guide to this published by DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, which includes a number of example statements you can include in procurement documentation to ensure that ESG issues are taken on board by prospective suppliers. So that's how the government makes its own decisions, but it also regulates how others make theirs too, of course. If you run a business, for example, the government makes it your responsibility to make sure that your labour supply chain is behaving responsibly. It's published online, and it says, amongst other things, that failing to take reasonable action to make sure that your supply of labour is legitimate can lead to significant legal, financial and reputational risks to your business. It could even stop your business from operating entirely. You may be liable for unpaid taxes and national insurance contributions. You may be unable to recover VAT payments, and you could be criminally prosecuted with an unlimited fine if someone acting on your behalf facilitates tax evasion. And it also says that proper checks are also important for protecting workers and preventing modern slavery. So it's your responsibility, not the government's, to ensure that your suppliers are paying their employees properly, for instance. And here are two recent initiatives where the government has intervened or may be about to intervene on an ESG issue. New regulations about the duties of trustees of pension schemes to take these things into account when taking their investment decisions. And notice what the minister said in this speech. It's my emphasis on the slide there, but he said, people are talking about ESG. And finally, here's a recent consultation exercise which DEFRA has carried out on preventing forests and other important natural areas from being converted illegally into agricultural land. I think the two interesting things here are that it says the law we're proposing would require a relatively small number of larger businesses, again, not the government notice, but businesses, to ensure that the forest risk commodities they use, that's commodities that can cause wide-scale deforestation, have been produced legally. It says this would set a clear requirement on businesses, and those who don't comply would be subject to fines. So I hope you found that interesting and that it's reassured you that our government takes its ESG responsibilities very seriously and expects private sector organisations to as well, to the extent that it'll sometimes step in to make the responsibility someone else's, not theirs, to make sure that they do. I wonder whether you think that's the right approach, and if so, whether there are other such areas too where government should intervene. Thank you for listening, and let us know what you think at the end. Thanks, John.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, that was a really great insight into the Green Book and what have you. I think I'm going to be looking those up afterwards. It will be make for interesting reading. So we are going to move on to really tonight. So far has been very much about the big picture, and I've introduced Gary Moore, who has some really practical bottom-up content for you on this area, because Gary is at the sharp end, as it were, with the charity. So Gary, if I could pass over to you.
Certainly, John, thanks for the intro. So good evening, folks. I'm going to just make a few remarks about digital accessibility. So in ESG, the S stands for social, and according to Wikipedia, that includes diversity and inclusion, consumer protection, human rights, and animal welfare, believe it or not. So obviously my area of expertise is diversity and inclusion. My day job is that I'm a Chief Executive of AbilityNet. We provide lots of services to help people with disabilities get the best out of their devices. Tech and disability really is the place where we operate. But we also have lots of commercial services and knowledge and expertise in the area that I'm just about to talk about. There's no digital world anymore, really. Everything is digital. Everything we want to do has a digital dimension to it. The good news, if you have any difficulty in using any of the digital services, is that the devices that we're delivering these services on are now massively better equipped at the accessibility level than they were, for example, 10 years ago. So huge steps forward from people like Apple, Microsoft, Google, in terms of building in those platform features. So that reduces the number of specialist devices that you need people to have or developers to develop for. We're now talking about desktop web, and we're talking about apps on devices. So really, that's good news for people with accessibility requirements, but it's also good news for developers because the frameworks are there, and there are really few excuses these days to produce inaccessible services. So really, as producers of socially responsible products and services, our job is to envisage what those barriers might look like. And it's just like any part of your end-to-end business model. You want friction to be at a minimum for your consumers at every step of the way. So as developers of digital services, you need to do that, anticipate and design out at the digital level. So what are those barriers? I guess you can anticipate what they might be. Mobility and touch. Not everyone has the same dexterity with a mouse. That's particularly true as people age. All of these impairments, they're not black and white conditions. They are gradual. So my hearing is gradually getting worse. The TV gets louder with every passing year. My vision is gradually getting worse. My specs are stronger now than they were, 10 years ago. Cognitive and learning impairments are much better recognized now. Dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysnumeracy. That's a lot of that is about how people perceive the language that you put on a screen. So just trying to think about those things through other people's eyes, ears, and senses is a little bit of the job of the inclusive designer. Let's move into the inclusive design comments. So yeah, I guess that lots of you, you work in the world of tech, so you'll have come across lots of these common accessibility issues. I'll pick the top three. I'm not going to read them all, but color contrast, that's an easy one to avoid. Images on apps and websites really ought to have alt text on them so that people using screen readers know what's embedded in the image. And this is such an easy one to deal with and to make sure it doesn't impact your users. Lack of keyboard access. There are still lots of websites that I go to where I must have a mouse to navigate the screen. And it doesn't need to be so. As I say, I won't read through all of those. You get the gist, where careless design or not putting yourself in the shoes of the widest section of your audience might limit your appeal. So the good news is for people who are funding the development of applications is it's not an art. It is becoming more and more of a science. There are standards, and they are developed by an organization called the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and they've established standards called WCIT. We're currently at version 2.1, and you can audit an application or a website against these standards. So it's not arbitrary as to whether you do or don't have a good accessible service. It can be independently tested, measured, reported upon, and then remediated. So really, I'm sure that the best applications these days all have usability somewhere on the project manager's timescale. They really ought to have accessibility in there as well. And the very best applications are in that sweet spot where accessibility and usability overlap. The point being that if you do the accessibility thinking in your design and your testing, you're going to end up with an even better product that applies to an even wider selection of your target audience. So I'd like to talk about sticks and carrots. So the carrots are the business case. So on average, about 15% of any developed country will have a disability. In the UK, it's actually about 18%. And again, in the UK, about 80% of the people with a registered disability are of working age. Read into that, they are potentially spending customers. The problem with not serving these customers is that they don't complain, they just don't click, they don't buy, and they navigate away to a competitor. So picking up their adverse comment and reflection is very tricky. There's some fantastic feedback in a very, very simple website called The Big Hack, done by Scope, and that'll give you some excellent insights into what people with accessibility needs have found in common sites. But there is a great business case. If you're developing for an audience of 6, 7, or 8 figures, 20% of that is an awful lot of missed opportunity and revenue. So let's move on, Steve, to the next slide. And this is a little bit about the sticks. So we talked about carrots on the last slide, the positive business case. Legislation is bearing down on us all. So it started at the very end of the last century. Legislation referred to above the line here is impinging on private sector services, and below it's public sector. So I'm not going to go through the whole slide, but you can see that 20 years of development has brought very specific regulations to bear in the EU and the UK. In the UK, we already now have not just the Equalities Act from 2010, we now have the public sector accessibility regulations. These are very specific. They very specifically treat websites and mobile apps. They must all be accessible to a defined standard by certain timescales that you can see here. You can bet that in the next couple of years, the same provisions will be applicable to private companies. They definitely will be in the EU. They won't come here immediately because of Brexit, but you can see what the trend is. So the sticks are out there, but I think that the carrots are much, much stronger. When Julia asked me to participate, she asked me to think about the context of the finance sector. So when I think about all the customers that we interact with at AbilityNet, and we're just one service provider in this area, I can report to you that the finance sector is ahead of the game. The retail banks were very early into this. I'm guessing it's because their business case is really strong. They want to have 4, 5, 6 million people each using their retail applications. So the business case is compelling. Nevertheless, full marks, they're absolutely on it, and most of them have invested early and invested heavily. Retail insurers, they now start to feature on our customer list relatively recently. So I think they've got the message and they're starting to invest. Even some of the wholesale finance providers are laterally starting to invest in the accessibility of some of their services. So I give a pretty good thumbs up to the finance sector in the area of digital accessibility. So I'm not going to give you the any more on the AbilityNet sales pitch, but if you wanted to learn a bit more about this whole area, there are a number of places you could go, and if you want to contact me afterwards on my WCIT address, I'd be happy to further direct you. John, back to you.
Thank you very much, Gary. A very different perspective on focusing on the social aspects of ESG, and some good discussion about carrots and sticks. So we move to Rob, who's our last contributor this evening. So Rob, in the interest of time, I will pass quickly over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and good evening, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to look at the tech industry as a whole and ESG, and potentially, is there a role that WCIT might play? I mean, if you follow the IT services industry in particular, which Tech Market View does, then you'll see that they can be a little cynical on occasion. I mean, their headline was "Purpose, the latest must-have accessory in the IT industry." And they were talking through, you know, companies as big as Accenture, Capgemini, Capita, Fujitsu. All these companies have actually changed their reason for being, their purpose. Not really their mission. They're sort of, you know, we've gone beyond mission. This is a purpose, the reason for being. And you know, some people, and you know, some of you may have read in the FT last weekend, Marin Somerset Webb was talking about the fact that you know, surely the right thing to do is just to, you know, create profit for your and then which that profit may go into a pension scheme which may benefit society in that way. But I think there's more to it than that. And you know, saying here, for example, the purpose of an IT company may be to deliver IT services. But we've now come across this idea that we don't live alone. We're not little islands. We don't exist in and of ourselves as businesses. We exist within society, communities, and this notion of a stakeholder is become very, very relevant. And especially now when reputations can be damaged and reputations can be managed, or sorry, very difficult to manage reputations due to social media, things like Glassdoor, etc. So it's very, very difficult these days. So in a sense, this grasp of trying to be sustainable, to be good, I think is part of a shift that's going on. Some people believe that the IT industry is like a fashion industry. It has fads. You know, it goes through, I don't know, networking, the internet, it'll go through cloud computing, it goes through, you know, Unix and whatever, but it goes through waves. Maybe what we're seeing now is the IT industry, which is now pervasive across society, serving multiple different industries and companies. Maybe what we're seeing is actually that wave is gone beyond a fashion, and maybe this is actually part of each company involved in tech. One thing, though, I'll just put on the end of this slide is that IT companies want to ensure that a key ingredient in that chain, the challenge is going to be ensuring their entire business believes in the new principles and acts accordingly. And that runs across, if you're thinking of ESG, environmental, social, and indeed governance. And that needs to be spread across everybody. Now, what I was talking about here was about whether the WCIT ought to be involved. Now, WCIT, as livery companies, have individual members. So we're a group of individuals, all of which come from a rich history and background with lots of different organizations. So in a sense, you know, maybe we're already involved in this. I mean, WCIT and most livery companies are involved in philanthropy and giving back and in service and in charity. so maybe what role might we play with companies and organizations who are looking to do this? So maybe part of what we could do is to provoke. We might be able to provoke people to say, hey, it's time for you to get involved in this if you're not already. And there's a few things that may persuade people. Look, as Ray mentioned, the UK government actually takes social value to be really important within its procurement criteria, not just price. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, many companies are now saying, hey, sustainability is actually really, really important. And it's important for our future as a business. Investor preference, a lot of investors are now saying, hey, I want to invest in companies that are sustainable, that do take care of their employees, their communities they work in, and don't harm the planet. Corporate performance, interesting enough, it's a really interesting document came out of McKinsey that said that those companies that do adopt and report on ESG, and I'm taking, by the way, ESG and social value as being a combination, sort of one and the same for the purposes of this argument. That says that McKinsey says that companies that actually adopt and report in these areas have improved performance. And lastly, employee preference. I mean, there's been several studies have shown that millennials and Gen Z want to work for organizations who've got a broad purpose beyond profit. I mean, if we were going to persuade companies as individuals and as an organization, for companies to really get involved, what kind of things could we encourage them to get involved in? There's a multiple list. This is a poor list because it doesn't involve in all the things they could get involved in. It's literally a handful of things, a handful of examples. And it goes all the way from supporting education, through supporting training, through supporting environmental use and decreasing congestion, car sharing and everything like this, to actually having great policies on personal behavior. So if we as a livery company were to believe that we have a role here, maybe our role may be to activate some of this interest across the industry. Maybe one of the things we could do, we could organize a peer group for tech companies who are involved and want to learn more or want to be better at being involved in ESG and social value. We could develop a code of conduct. One of the great things about the WCIT is we're a neutral organization. We're not for trade and we're not for professional standards. We're actually representing a broad industry and we're the philanthropic part of that industry. So maybe we could actually do something and gather people to create those codes of conduct against which people could measure themselves. We've got lots of programs we do. IT for Arts, IT for Sea, Thames Reach, AbilityNet. I mean, all of these they may require volunteers. And one of the things that companies could do is to provide the talent they've got into the community. Maybe they could raise funds. If they raise funds, maybe we could direct those funds through into our own charity. And our charity is a brilliant thing because what it does is it leverages the money which it actually supplies to organizations for activities that use the power of IT to leverage the impact. We can provide mentors to tech organizations who want to expand into ESG and SV. And if you think about it, the people who've been speaking tonight would be brilliant mentors, wouldn't they? So how could we do this? So I'm keen that to understand whether people feel we ought to be involved and in what way. So with that, I'd be keen to learn more from what you think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Yeah, that was you raised some pretty stark points there. Now we've had quite a few questions coming in over the evening. So I was going to just pass some of those on to you for your immediate comments. And if I could just direct them to one, and then perhaps if anyone else wishes to put their comment in to the panel. But one question that came up was, how aligned do we actually believe the livery movement is behind ESG principles? And I was going to start that one with Gary, because he's been a liveryman for many years and he's had experience across a whole groups of companies with his current job, but also with the activities that he's taken on the pro bono panel before that. So Gary, do you think the livery movement is aligned behind ESG principles?
I think at the principles level, John, I think we'd have to say yes. I mean, most livery companies have a very, very strong charitable ethic these days. Most of them aren't, about raising more trade externally, and most of them are very motivated. How often do you hear the phrase, "I'm here because I want to give back," amongst the people who want to join our livery company? So I think at the highest level, we'd have to give the livery movement a cleanish bill of health. Are we doing all the little environmental things we could do in the way we run our halls, in the way we conduct our business? I'm sure there's room for improvement, but I think we're probably edging in the positive end of the scale. And
Ray, what do you think about the influence that livery companies do clearly have a huge influence? If you look across the spectrum from the airline pilots company through to the watermen to the master mariners. So, but are they really using that influence to really reinforce these ESG principles, or is that something that we could perhaps be a catalyst to assist with?
I think it varies, John, and it harks back to Rob's final point. I mean, if we look at ourselves as an example here, we often bemoan the fact that we're not as widely known within the IT profession as we would like to be. And there's probably some way to go for us in terms of influencing what IT organizations do because of that, the degree of visibility that we have. So I think we've all got lots to do. Some of the more established livery companies, or the more historic ones, have had a lot longer than us, of course, in order to gain that influence and that visibility. And they will be doing perhaps better than us for that reason in that respect. But as Rob said, this is, I think, a call to arms to us to decide how we can make that happen with regard to our profession, because certainly there's more we can do, as he says.
John, if I might just return on reflection to the first question you first asked me. As I say, I think we probably would pass muster with most external scrutiny on E and S. There might be a few people out there who wonder about the governance of livery companies in the city. I know everyone attending here is almost certainly completely comfortable with it, but there are elements of it that could be described as, dark smoke-filled rooms. So, governance might be not an area where we would achieve a full bill of clean health, shall we say. Just an observation.
Yeah, Gary, always rely on you to be a controversial figure in this thing. So just as I say, we had a large number of questions. One of the questions was very much was around the ESG scoring system and how it's interpreted. Well, I did some work when I was chaired the Institute of Leadership Management at a conference, and I recall that there was this global reporting initiative. There's the carbon disclosure project. There's the sustainability accounting standards. There are at least 7 or 8 that go through in terms of quantification or trying to quantify these ESG issues, which are then corporates are scored against. How do we deal with that? So, Indranil, over to you. What do you think? Are there too many standards? Should they be consolidated? Should they be rationalized?
Yeah, there are many standards in the market, and I guess there are more that people are looking for. Even creating this morning, I was reading a newspaper article saying that whether there should be an accounting standards now built on a sustainability and ESG. This is an issue, but I think there's a commonality between all the tools that are available in the market. Well, standards are standards that needs to be built to derive, those, scoring system or how you score them. But there are a couple of things that comes to my mind, because what I see in the organizations that we all talk about when we're scoring, of course, from an insurance perspective, we do have very specific scoring algorithms in terms of, the ESG factors, whether it's for climate change or biodiversity or so on, the weightage and all kinds of stuff. But what I would suggest is that, organizations needs to get more specific, understanding the multiple way those ESG factors can create the value as an individual that inspire, similarly getting more practical and not talk, well, we're going to do something for the planet. Okay, planet it's too large. We be more specific in terms of ideally hard metric and not vague statements like save the planet, or be more realistic and real in terms of acknowledging that there is a result that we are going after, the massive value destruction.
Well, so get more granular is what you're saying there. Get more granular. Of course, there is a school of thought. If you write the standard, then it's easier for you to comply with it as well. So it's there's a bit of a, I think, an element of that certainly in some of the standards that I've seen. Rob, what do you think about the whole area of standards? I mean, because there's a lot of greenwashing that we see going on with businesses.
The standards are only as good as how they're observed in a time of stress, aren't they? I mean, everybody has standards when or adheres to standards in good times. It's when it gets a bit tough. But I think that the best standards are those which, in a sense, come from a group of people who want to adhere to those and hold each other to them. And that's why I think that there could be a potential for us as a livery company to create with leaders in the broad industry to create a standard for IT organizations, be they suppliers or organizations. Why don't we take the lead in trying to amalgamate some of the good things from the multitude of different measurement systems and bring something that's entirely appropriate for our sector? I believe that's possible, and I think we ought to have a go at it. A personal belief.
And I would agree with you, and I love the way you were looking at your next box next to you, seeing Simon sitting there. So he can pick that one up. We can discuss that at the next meeting. But the thing at the moment is that where will ESG fit in terms of the reality of this carnage of a pandemic, which is actually going on, in terms of priorities at this juncture? I mean, is this going to be something that really is going to get people are going to put their effort into when there is a massive social and economic disruption? So Ray, what do you feel about it? Is this an area that government are going to really focus on in this catastrophic times?
Well, I think you've seen plenty of examples of where it's done that, John, where it's stepped in to, certainly in my lifetime, unprecedented degree to make sure that people weren't as disadvantaged as they would otherwise have been by what's been going on. And I think there is a role for government in a number of other areas too. I noticed a question, I think Liz had put one in the chat box around things like infrastructure projects. I'm moving away from the pandemic now just to pick up a couple of other things, John. Infrastructure projects to encourage things like new forms of heating. They should, Liz, and they are. And coincidentally, a week or two ago, I was working on something called the Heat Networks Investments Project in the Department for Business, which is making government funding available to encourage that form of heating. Just quickly, Julia had a question about, I think it was Julia, about tax reliefs for inclusive design, which is an interesting one, Julia. I think most of us would feel that there are types of inclusive design which ought to be mandated rather than encouraged. So we all agree that people with a disability ought to have the same rights as the rest of us, or the same ability as the rest of us to go to work or go to a shop or go to a recreational activity. So I think most of us would feel that should be mandated rather than simply encouraged by tax breaks. On the other hand, there are other forms of inclusivity which perhaps are not to do with human rights, but just to do with things that we might want to encourage. And this year in the budget, the government put aside, I think it was nearly £10 billion for an affordable homes program to make home ownership more inclusive than it's otherwise would have been. So there certainly is a role for government, and governments are stepping in and doing these things.
Well, I mean, it sounds very impressive, the list of things, and it's probably very good that they are stepping in. Because do we feel there is an inherent conflict between providing shareholder value and returns, and then contributing to an ESG agenda and taking full responsibility there? Is there a real kind of conflict there? So Indradil, because that's one I'm going to pass over to you to.
Yeah, it is, and I guess in the boardroom, people are now notably looking at executive compensation, dividend payouts, and stock buyouts, and many other things. And the critical element that everyone is sitting and thinking is about short-term strategic decisions and long-term strategic planning. And most of the stakeholders, or as stakeholders, a couple of considerations that I see in the boardroom that being discussed are, board oversights for risk management because of the pandemic situation, or critical incidents and systematic risk management. We're talking about human capital issues. You're talking about business model resilience. You're talking about supply chain, depending on businesses. For example, in healthcare, it's a huge topic that's being discussed at the moment. We're also talking about consumer, welfare and impact on communities. What are we doing? Of course, and if you really, ask me, companies are spending a huge amount of effort, in disclosing their ESG activities today. And if you look at the S&P 500, even in 2011-12, only 20% of the S&P firms were really talking and reporting about, ESG activities. Today, almost 90% of them are writing it. They all started with 5 pages. Now they write 90, 100 pages, 200 pages. Now, they're writing books on on what they're doing from an ESG perspective, and all about aligning, those values to create the board, at the boardroom, and linking back into the business and the cash flow.
So I can see that two companies are putting the effort in there. I mean, Rob, are we really brave enough to take this on as a delivery? Are we brave enough to put our head above the parapet on this kind of issue? Because traditionally, delivery companies don't tend to put their heads above the parapet too often.
I think when things are party political, I think that there's a challenge, for delivery companies who aren't by their nature neutral. They are, as I say, they're philanthropic. They aim to do good. But I think we've got to test it. Let's test actually. Let's take it in stages. Let's start small. Let's see whether it works. If it works, let's expand it further. I think that there is from my own experience, I think there is a lack of knowledge out there certainly from the IT supplier community that I'm very familiar with. They don't know what to do. And I think that somebody helping them to know what to do and how they can get involved and how they can become better at what they do. I believe that is something that will be welcomed. But I think we need to do it in stages and phases. If we do, and it proves to be good, then I think we ought to leap on it and do and not be afraid.
A great way to conclude, really, because old Father Time has just been slicing away at our evening, and it's time for me to pass over to Simon to give a few closing words. Simon, over to you.
Great, thank you, John. I have to say ESG is an amazingly broad subject with so many different lenses to think about, and it's been a very thought-provoking evening. I hope everyone would agree, with so much space to make a real difference in line with our livery thinking and ethos. As Julia said earlier, hopefully tonight's just the start of our dialogue, and I know some really good discussions have taken place previously, but hopefully it's a good opportunity for us to come together in thinking about how we can run more events, activities, and actually drive this forward, both within WCIT and also some related sort of outside groups like the Financial Services Group of livery companies that I know several of us are particularly interested in. I hope you've all enjoyed this Talking Tuesday session. A quick plug, if I may, as chair of WCIT's Financial Services Technology Panel. As you heard earlier, we're just over a year old, but if you're involved in financial services tech in some form or work in IT in the city, please do consider joining our panel. Finally, some really big thank yous. First of all to John as our chair, but also Julia, who really championed tonight and made it happen. So thank you to Julia in particular, but also our excellent speakers, so Anders, Indranil, Ray, Gary, Rob. Also, I know people like Liz, Steve Smith and Julia Condon, who've been really helping push things along behind the scenes. And also to Susan and the whole WCIT events team, because I know there were a few issues behind the scenes that got seamlessly resolved from our point of view. So thank you to everybody. That's the end of our session this evening, but please do let us have your feedback and ideas. And we very much hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.